It was just another ordinary afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting warm golden hues over the neatly trimmed lawns and rows of pristine houses. The street was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but that peace was about to be shattered by an encounter no one saw coming. At the corner of the block, near a local cafe, a man sat on the pavement. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed, and his hands rough from years of hard labor. His face carried the weight of experiences most could never understand. His eyes holding stories of sacrifice, of battles fought far from home. He was a veteran, a man who had once worn the uniform of the United States military with pride. But now, life had dealt him a cruel hand, leaving him without a home, without a family, and with nowhere else to go. As he quietly sat, hoping for a moment of rest, a woman stepped out of the cafe. Her expensive handbag swung from her arm, her designer sunglasses perched perfectly on her nose. She took one look at the man and wrinkled her face in disgust. To her, he was nothing more than an eyesore, a problem that needed to be removed. She scoffed loudly, shaking her head before pulling out her phone. Within seconds, her voice rang out in the afternoon air, sharp and demanding. "Yes, I need the police immediately. There's a suspicious homeless man sitting outside the cafe, and he's making everyone uncomfortable. He looks dangerous. He might be on drugs. Please send someone right away." Her words dripped with entitlement, her tone filled with an urgency that wasn't real. She glanced around, hoping to see nods of agreement from the people nearby, but instead, a few customers looked at her with uneasy expressions. The veteran lifted his head, his tired eyes meeting hers. He had heard it all before. The accusations, the assumptions, the fear in people's eyes when they saw him. It was nothing new. He sighed and braced himself for what was coming. Minutes passed, and then the sound of sirens filled the air. A police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing, and 2 officers stepped out. The woman smirked, crossing her arms as if she had just accomplished something important. She expected them to immediately remove the man, to haul him off as if he were some criminal disturbing the peace. But what happened next left everyone speechless. The air felt heavy as the officers stepped out of their cruiser. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces unreadable, but there was something in their demeanor that didn't match the usual response Karen was expecting. She stood tall, adjusting her sunglasses as she motioned toward the veteran with a flick of her wrist. "There he is," she said, her voice laced with exaggerated concern. "I don't know what he's doing here, but he's making everyone uncomfortable. He could be dangerous." The officers exchanged a glance, then turned their attention to the man sitting on the pavement. He hadn't moved. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his lap, his head slightly bowed. He didn't flinch, didn't protest. He had been through worse. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm but firm presence, stepped forward, crouched down. "Sir," he said gently, "what's your name?" The veteran hesitated before answering. "David." His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a while. "David, do you have a place to stay tonight?" the officer asked, his tone carrying something unexpected, concern. Karen's expression twisted into confusion. "Excuse me, aren't you going to do something about this? He's loitering, probably trespassing." The other officer, a woman with sharp eyes, finally turned to her. "Ma'am, did this man threaten you?" Karen blinked. "Well, no, but did he say anything inappropriate? Act aggressively?" "No, but look at him. He's sitting outside a business. People don't want to see this when they're trying to have coffee." She scoffed, throwing her hands up. "This neighborhood isn't safe with people like him just hanging around." David exhaled, staring at the pavement, as if he had already played this conversation in his head before it even started. The officers, however, weren't responding the way Karen expected. Instead of immediately escorting him away, they remained focused on David. "David," the first officer said, "are you a veteran?" David nodded slowly. "Served 2 tours overseas." Something shifted in the officer's expression. There was a quiet understanding there, a recognition of something deeper. The female officer spoke up this time, her voice softer. "I served 2. Army. What branch were you in?" "Marines," David replied. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, great. Now you're making friends. Are you seriously telling me you're not going to do anything? He's ruining the atmosphere of this place." The female officer's jaw tightened. She turned back to Karen, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, last I checked, sitting in a public space wasn't a crime." Karen's face turned red. "So you're just going to let him stay here? We're going to make sure he's okay," the officer corrected. "That's our job." For the first time, David lifted his head fully and met her gaze. He had expected hostility, expected to be treated like an inconvenience, like he so often was, but this was different. The male officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "David, there's a shelter nearby that helps veterans. They can provide food, a place to sleep, and help you get back on your feet. Do you need a ride there?" David hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't want help. It was that accepting it felt foreign, like something he had forgotten how to do. He had spent so long feeling invisible, pushed aside, that part of him had stopped expecting kindness from anyone. Karen, however, was not impressed. "Unbelievable," she muttered, crossing her arms. "You're seriously rewarding this kind of behavior. No wonder the world is falling apart." The officers ignored her. They were waiting for David's response. Finally he nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think I'd like that." The male officer gave a small nod and extended a hand to help him up. David hesitated again before gripping it, feeling the solid strength of someone who wasn't looking down on him, but instead pulling him back onto his feet. As the officers helped him to the cruiser, Karen stood there fuming. "You're making a mistake," she snapped. "People like him don't change. They're just looking for handouts." The female officer turned back one last time. "No, ma'am," she said firmly. "He's looking for a second chance." And with that, they drove off, leaving Karen standing alone on the sidewalk, still clutching her expensive handbag, still wrapped in her own bitterness, as the world around her continued moving forward without her. As the police cruiser drove away, David sat in the back seat, staring out the window. The city passed by in a blur. Rows of buildings, people walking the sidewalks, cars rushing by, all moving with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, someone had actually looked at him, really looked at him, not as a burden, but as a person. The male officer glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You all right back there?" David swallowed, his throat dry. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Just not used to this." The female officer, sitting in the passenger seat, turned slightly to face him. "Used to what?" David thought for a moment. "People giving a damn." The car fell silent for a bit. Then the male officer spoke. "Well, they should. And whether you believe it or not, there are still people out here who do." David nodded, but said nothing. He wanted to believe that. He really did. A few minutes later, the car pulled up in front of a small but well-kept building. A sign near the entrance read, "Veterans Outreach and Housing Assistance." The officers stepped out, and David followed, unsure of what to expect. As they approached the front doors, A man in his late 50s stepped out. He wore a simple polo and jeans, but the way he carried himself, strong posture, steady eyes, told David everything he needed to know. Military. "You must be David," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Mark. I run this place." David hesitated before shaking his hand. Mark's grip was firm but warm, like he understood without having to say a word. "Come on in," Mark said. "Let's get you settled." The officers watched as David followed Mark inside. The female officer called out, "Take care of yourself, all right?" David turned back for a moment. He didn't say much, but the nod he gave them carried more weight than words ever could. Inside the shelter was nothing fancy. Just a few rooms, a common area, and a small kitchen. But it was clean, safe, a place where he wouldn't be looked at like he was nothing. Mark led him to a small room with a simple bed, a nightstand, and a window. "It's not much," Mark said, "but it's yours. Showers down the hall. We've got meals in the kitchen, job resources, counseling, whatever you need. No pressure, no judgment. Just take things one step at a time." David ran a hand over the blanket on the bed. It had been years since he'd had a bed to call his own. Mark studied him for a moment. "I know it's not easy accepting help. Feels like you're losing a part of yourself. But trust me, this isn't a handout. It's a new start, and you're not alone anymore." David didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he just nodded. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about how close he had come to just being another forgotten face on the street. How one moment, a stranger's complaint, a phone call, could have gone so differently. But instead of being treated like a problem, he had been treated like a person. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. Meanwhile, across town, Karen sat in her pristine home, scrolling through her phone. She had expected people to agree with her, to support what she had done, but instead, she found herself facing a wave of backlash. Someone at the cafe had recorded the incident. The video had gone viral, with thousands of comments calling her out for her behavior. People were condemning her actions, pointing out how quick she had been to judge, how easily she had dismissed someone who had served the very country she lived in comfortably. Her face burned with embarrassment, but deep down, beneath the frustration and denial, there was something else, something she didn't want to admit. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong, but that was something she would have to face on her own. As for David, his journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, still demons to face, but this time, he wasn't fighting alone, and sometimes that made all the difference.